My name is Alma Reeves, and I was 31 years old the night my brother-in-law looked across the Christmas dinner table, smiled like he was doing me a favor, and said, "We're keeping the anniversary trip to just the Caldwells this year. No offense to the civilians." He laughed at his own joke. Leonard, my father-in-law, found something very interesting in the grain of the table. Beverly, my mother-in-law, reached for the bread basket. Darcy, Griffin's wife, gave one of those tight little smiles that means nothing. And my husband, Nolan, the man who had looked me in the eye 8 years ago and promised to put me first, said, "Make sense, babe. It'll be quick." I had a forkful of green beans suspended halfway to my mouth. I set it down very carefully. I picked up my napkin, touched the corners of my lips, and excused myself to the restroom. I didn't come back for 12 minutes, long enough to sit on the edge of their guest bathroom tub, breathe through my nose the way my therapist had taught me, and remind myself that I was a grown woman, with a mortgage, and a management title, and a very good internal thermostat for what I was allowed to feel in public. Before I get into what happened after that, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. If you've ever sat at a table where the people who were supposed to claim you looked right through you instead. You already know exactly what that bathroom felt like. I met Nolan Caldwell 9 years ago at a work conference in Chicago. He was funny and warm, and slightly rumpled in the way that suggests competence, rather than carelessness, and I was gone for him within 48 hours. We dated long distance for 14 months. I moved for him. We married on a cloudy October Saturday that turned beautiful by the ceremony, which felt like a sign. I know now that weather is not an omen. But I was 23 and in love, and I believed it. My family was nothing like his. My parents were practical people. My mother taught 4th grade in the same elementary school for 30 years, and my father drove for a regional freight company. We didn't have money for extras. We had each other and a house in a town most people drove through without stopping. I loved them in the simple way you love people who have never once made you earn it. The Caldwells operated on a different frequency. Leonard had built a small auto parts distributorship from nothing, and wore that fact like a badge pinned to every conversation. Beverly had been a buyer for a regional department store chain before she retired, and she retained an elegance that made even her grocery lists seem intentional. Griffin was 4 years older than Nolan, larger in the room by volume and smaller by achievement, and he had spent most of his adult life circling their father's business without ever quite landing. Darcy had been Griffin's wife for 12 years to my 8, and somehow she'd been absorbed into the family in a way I never quite was. I never figured out the mechanism. I watched her for years trying to reverse engineer it. Eventually, I stopped trying. The first time I noticed the distance, we were at Leonard's birthday dinner, about 6 months into the marriage. A cousin stood up to make a toast and swept his arm around the table saying, "All the Caldwell kids," meaning Griffin, Nolan, and their sister, Britt. His arm didn't include me. It probably wasn't intentional. It was the kind of nothing that doesn't mean anything once, but means something, when it happens enough times, that you start anticipating it. I never said anything. That's the part that matters most when I look back. I was raised to show up, to contribute, to be useful, to hold the weight without announcing it, and I did exactly that. When Leonard's distributorship hit a rough patch 3 years into our marriage, the margins on auto parts were compressing as more suppliers went direct to consumer. He came to Nolan one evening, quiet and stiff in the way proud men ask for help. Nolan came to me. The number was $45,000. I had it, barely, between savings and a small inheritance from my grandmother. My financial advisor told me it was a meaningful risk. I had an attorney draw up a proper promissory note anyway, repayment schedule, interest terms, everything signed. Leonard called it unnecessary. I said I just liked things organized. He signed it. We shook hands. He called me kiddo for the first time that evening, with something in his voice that felt like the beginning of real warmth. That $45,000 was never repaid. Not partially, not once. What I got, 18 months later, was a Thanksgiving card with "So grateful for everything" written inside in Beverly's neat handwriting, followed by Leonard's name. 2 years after that, Griffin called Nolan at 11 on a Tuesday night. His truck had been repossessed. He needed $15,000 by Friday, or he'd lose a delivery contract that was, according to Griffin, all but guaranteed income once he got the logistics sorted. I transferred the money by Thursday. There was no promissory note because Griffin said paperwork between family was for people who didn't trust each other. I told myself trust didn't mean unprotected. I wrote the check anyway, and told myself that's what family did. Beverly slipped on her back porch steps the following spring. The hip injury wasn't severe enough for surgery, but left her in real, chronic pain, and the physical therapy she needed wasn't fully covered by the insurance she and Leonard carried. I started covering the monthly shortfall, $800 a month. I set up a separate account and paid the clinic directly, so it never had to be a conversation over dinner, never had to cost Beverly the dignity of being discussed. She thanked me once, quietly, and neither of us mentioned it again. Britt's wedding came that same June. The venue deposit came up short when Leonard's check bounced, and they needed $12,000 by Monday to keep the booking. Nolan called me from the living room where I could hear him. I opened the laptop and transferred the money before he finished explaining. I never sat down and tallied the running total. I think on some level that was by design. If I didn't add it up, it remained abstract. Abstract felt manageable. A real number felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The Christmas dinner where everything finally changed started out like all the others. Beverly made prime rib. Leonard had a fire going in the living room. Britt was visiting with her husband and their new baby. And the house had that warm, particular chaos of too many people who all know where everything is kept. I had just received the best news of my professional year. The previous week, after 3 years of quietly outworking everyone around me, my company had promoted me to director of operations. It was a real title change, with real scope and a salary increase I hadn't let myself fully believe was coming. I mentioned it at dinner only when Nolan nudged me, because I've never been someone who announces myself. Griffin congratulated me in that tone people use when something is the correct size and no bigger. Leonard said, "That's great, kiddo," and moved the conversation to whether the deck needed refinishing in the spring. Beverly said she was proud of me, and I believed her, and I held on to that. Then, over dessert, Griffin leaned back in his chair the way he did when he had something to say. He said he'd been thinking about their parents' 40th anniversary in March. Said they deserved something real, not just a dinner but a real trip. Said he'd found a lodge up in the mountains, 3 nights, the family all together. His eyes moved around the table, Leonard, Beverly, Nolan, Britt, and the sweep of his gaze went past me the way a flashlight moves past furniture. "Just the 5 Caldwells," he said. "Keep it intimate. No offense to the civilians." He smiled. Darcy made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite objection. I looked at Nolan. Nolan was looking at his pie. "Makes sense, babe," he said. "It'll be quick." The 12 minutes on the edge of the bathroom tub, the breathing. Then back to the table, where I finished dinner and helped Beverly with the dishes and hugged everyone at the door, and drove home through the dark without saying anything in the car. Because there was nothing I trusted myself to say. 4 days later, Leonard texted me. "Hey sweetheart, any chance you could float us $3,400? Just for the lodge deposit. You know how we'll sort you out end of next month. Thanks." I read it 3 times. Then I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long time looking at the tile grout. My colleague and best friend Luz called me that evening about a work schedule. I answered, we handled the work thing, and then I said, "Something happened and I need to say it out loud." The whole story came out. Christmas dinner, Griffin's comment, the way Nolan had looked at his pie, the 4 days of silence, the text that followed. When I finished, Luz was quiet for a moment. "Alma," she said, "you have been financially supporting people who do not consider you family. I need you to hear that sentence." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a glass of water and opened the spreadsheet I kept for my accountant. I had never run a true total. I started with Leonard's 45,000, added Griffin's 15. Then I pulled up the payment history on Beverly's physical therapy account, $22,400 over the years I had been quietly covering it. Britt's wedding, $12,000. The new water heater for Leonard's rental cabin one winter when they were short. The bond when one of Griffin's employees got into a situation he needed sorted before Monday. 2 plane tickets when Beverly's mother was dying, and neither Leonard nor Griffin could cover the travel. When I added it all, the number was $104,280. I sat with that number for a long time. It didn't make me angry, not right then. It made me very, very still. I picked up my phone, opened Leonard's text, typed. "Sorry, Leonard. I thought the trip was a Caldwell's only thing." I pressed send, put the phone down, went to bed, slept better than I had in months. By morning I had 11 messages waiting. Leonard's reply was long and confused. Of course I was welcome to join the trip. He'd never meant to imply otherwise. He would speak to Griffin. Griffin had a certain way of saying things. No acknowledgement that he'd sent a money request 4 days after his son had called me a civilian at the family table. No apology. Just rapid repositioning, and not even clean repositioning. The kind that assumes you didn't notice the gap between what was said and what is now being said. Griffin's text was shorter and less diplomatic. He said I'd always had a chip on my shoulder about being an outsider. He said he'd been joking. He said the women in his family had always understood his sense of humor. Nolan called while I was at my desk at work. His family had looped him in. He said he thought I might be reading too much into the Christmas comment. He said Griffin didn't mean it the way it sounded. He said, "Could we please not turn one dinner into a whole event?" I said, "Nolan, your brother told me I was a civilian at your parents' table. You sat there and said nothing. 4 days later your father asked me for money. I need you to sit with what that looks like from where I'm standing." A long pause. "It's complicated," he said. I told him I'd be home by 7. That evening I sent a single email to Leonard, Griffin, Nolan, and Britt. No dramatic subject line, just my name and the word note. Inside, I documented every financial contribution I had made to the family over 8 years. Dates, amounts, the promissory note Leonard had signed, which was now 3 years past its repayment start date. I noted that I was removing myself from the cabin maintenance fund I'd been contributing to, and I closed with one paragraph. I have valued my place in this family and shown that through concrete action for 8 years. I understand now, more clearly than before, what my actual standing is. Going forward, my financial involvement will reflect that standing. I wish everyone a wonderful anniversary trip. I did not elaborate on what that standing was. I didn't need to. 3 days later they came to the house. Leonard, Griffin, and Beverly. Nolan let them in. He stood by the door with his arms crossed and did not look at me, which told me everything about how much of this fight he'd decided to let me carry alone. Leonard went first. His tone moved between conciliatory and expectant, sometimes in the same sentence. There had been a misunderstanding. Griffin said things without thinking. Of course I was family. I said. Leonard, you signed a promissory note in 2019. You have not made a single payment in 3 years. I have been covering your wife's medical care every month without being asked to stop. Your son called me a civilian at your dinner table on Christmas. 4 days after that you texted me for $3,400 without one word of acknowledgement. Which part of that is a misunderstanding? Griffin's composure broke somewhere around the third sentence. He said I had always held the money over their heads. He said plenty of people contributed to their families without turning it into a ledger. He said if I wanted to be treated like a Caldwell, maybe I should stop acting like their accountant. I acted like your accountant, I said, because no one else was keeping track. That's not fair. Which number in my spreadsheet isn't accurate? He didn't answer. Beverly was looking at the carpet. I had loved Beverly. I had her pie crust recipe memorized. She had called me on my work anniversary 2 years running. She was looking at the carpet like it contained instructions. Nolan was still by the door, still hadn't spoken. Griffin kept going. He said this was exactly the kind of thing that made it hard to fully fold someone into a family. The accounting, the documentation, the way I turned everything into a transaction. He said maybe if I'd led with generosity instead of paperwork, things would have landed differently. Generosity, I said. $104,000. 8 years, 0 payments on the signed loan. That's the generosity you're describing as insufficient. You kept a spreadsheet. Griffin, Nolan's voice from the door, quiet. Something in the quality of it made everyone stop. He crossed his arms tighter, looking at the floor. Then he looked up. She's right, he said. I should have said something at Christmas and I didn't, and that was wrong. I've been telling myself for years that keeping the peace was the same as keeping everyone safe. It wasn't. It just kept everyone comfortable except her. Griffin told him he was going to regret letting this come between him and his family. Nolan said, I need you all to go. Leonard pointed at me on his way out, the way people do when they've run out of words and need a gesture to stand in. Beverly paused at the door and looked back at me with something in her face I couldn't name precisely, not apology, but close. Something that knew what it should be, even if it couldn't quite get there. What followed was 2 weeks of the extended family group chain being used at full capacity. Cousins and aunts I saw twice a year at holidays, materialized with opinions delivered at conversational volume. The version of events that circulated, as best I could reconstruct it, was that I had ambushed the Caldwells with financial demands out of nowhere. I sent one reply to the chain. I kept it to facts. 8 years, $104,000, a signed promissory note, a comment at Christmas dinner about civilians. I attached the spreadsheet, then I muted the thread and didn't look at it again. Nolan and I spent 3 of the hardest weeks of our marriage being honest at the kitchen table in the evenings. He told me he had known, somewhere underneath all his wanting things to be fine, that his family treated me differently. He had told himself it was their personality, that I was strong enough to absorb it, that time would smooth it out. He said he was ashamed, that it had taken a confrontation of this scale for him to say out loud what he'd privately understood for years. I told him I was ashamed of how long I'd spent pretending the table was level, when I'd been holding one end up the whole time. We started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Moss who had a direct manner, and no interest in people talking around the actual subject. It was uncomfortable and clarifying in equal measure, which I understand is the point. The Caldwell consequences arrived slowly, the way real consequences usually do. Leonard's business hit another rough stretch. Without the quiet consultations and the cash infusions that had smoothed things over, the problems that had been deferred became problems that had to be faced. Griffin sold his truck, voluntary this time, to cover his share of the lodge deposit that had apparently already been charged to a card. The anniversary trip happened. Britt texted me in February to say it was quieter than anyone expected, and Leonard had gotten food poisoning on day 2. No legal action ever materialized about the promissory note, despite a pointed phone call from Griffin implying he'd spoken to someone who knew about contracts. I had the note reviewed by a firm that worked with my company. The review took one afternoon. Every clause held. I didn't pursue aggressive collection. The money had stopped being the point. The document mattered as proof, evidence that I had been there, that my name and my contribution were on the record, that none of it had been imagined. Britt texted me a few times. She had been quieter than the others through the whole of it, and her texts were careful, feeling out where the conversation could go. I texted back, slowly, then more regularly. She hadn't had the same dynamics with me that Griffin had. She was younger, less certain of herself, and I think she had watched the whole thing and understood more than she'd let on in the moment. Darcy called once. She told me she'd had her own version of feeling like the perimeter of the family for years, that she'd just made a different calculation about how to handle it. I didn't know what to do with that conversation, so I mostly listened and thanked her for calling. We didn't become close, but the call mattered. Beverly reached out on a Saturday morning in late February. Her voice had the quality of someone who had rehearsed, and then set the rehearsal aside. I knew Griffin had a mean streak, she said. I've always known it. I kept telling myself it was bluntness, or how he shows love, or things he got from Leonard's side of the family. I should have said something at that table. I didn't. That was cowardly. I told her I appreciated her saying so. She asked about the promotion. I told her about the role, the scope of it, what it actually meant, day to day. She said she wasn't surprised. Said she had thought since early on that I was one of the sharpest people she'd ever watched in a room, and then went quiet for a moment in a way that sounded like it cost her something. I arranged to resume her physical therapy payments through the clinic the following week. Every other boundary stayed where I'd put it. Nolan and I planned a trip for our 9th anniversary. A week in coastal Maine, a rental cottage with a porch that faced water. The night before we left, I made pasta and we ate outside, and he told me that watching me hold a line he should have held years ago had shown him something about himself he hadn't been willing to see clearly before. I kept thinking that keeping the peace was the same as protecting everyone, he said. I didn't understand I was the only one not protecting you. Luz threw what she called a very casual, entirely mandatory dinner for my promotion. 6 people, her apartment, homemade food, a cake with my new title written on it in slightly uneven frosting. My parents drove 3 hours. My mother cried. My father shook Luz's hand and held it for a long moment and said, "Thank you for looking out for my kid," in the tone that means he knows there's more to the story and is choosing to say the one thing that's true. I started a standing monthly dinner with my own people, my parents, a cousin from 2 states over who makes me laugh harder than anyone I know, a college friend who'd recently moved back. We rotate houses. Someone always brings too much wine. Nobody is keeping scores. Nobody is performing membership. We are simply people who have chosen each other repeatedly and without conditions. I think about that bathroom tub sometimes, the cold edge of it, the 12 minutes. I think about how much energy I spent, for how many years, managing the distance between who I was and how that table saw me. Energy I could have spent differently. If you have spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never going to fully make room for you, I want you to hear this. You were not the problem. The seat was not the reward for being good enough. The table was just the wrong table. Setting a limit is not cruelty. It's not withdrawal for the sake of hurting someone. It is the most honest thing you can say to another person. This is who I am, and this is what I need to stay. If meeting that need is too much for someone, they have given you the most important information you will ever receive about them. The family I have now is smaller than the one I thought I was building. It is also completely real, all the way through. If any part of this landed with you, I want to hear about it in the comments below. What was the moment you stopped making yourself smaller? What finally gave you the courage to say enough? I read everything. I mean that. Whatever table you've been fighting for a seat at, you were worth a seat the whole time. You were always worth a seat.